Let's move that over here a little bit. Well, good morning. I would like to add my welcome today. And I would like to, good morning, Mark. Good to see you. I'd like to welcome those of you who are joining us online this morning. Glad that you are with us. And everybody should have gotten an email if you're on our regular email list, and on that email would have been a Zoom link and also an attachment with the study guide for this morning. Those of you who are here have it in your bulletins. Hopefully we didn't run out. And those of you who are watching online, you should be able to download it or use it online there. Well, today we start part 2 of our journey through Romans, and we're going to address a difficult concept, as you can see by our title this morning. Paul drops this on us early in his letter. He doesn't wait too long. After his introduction, he devotes a little bit of space to establish goodwill with his readers, and we're going to look at that in a moment. And then he gets down to business, and he begins to address some sensitive moral matters. And we will talk about some of those next time. So this thing that he drops in as he begins addressing the culture of his day is the wrath of God. And I think this subject, the wrath of God, has always been a difficult concept to understand in the balance with the love of God. So we're going to take on that challenge this morning and see if we can sort out what the Bible teaches on this subject. But first, let's take a look at his goodwill gesture to his church. So go with me to Romans chapter 1. And we're going to begin in verse 8 and look down through verse 15 to begin with. Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 8. Here's what Paul says. He says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world." Now, I'm thinking that Paul's using a little bit of hyperbole here. I doubt the whole world knew about this church, but at the same time, this is a church that is planted in the capital of the Roman Empire. It is surrounded by Roman culture, by corruptions, by danger, and this is a church of faith, and apparently their faith experience had spread out and was known amongst other churches in the empire. So verse 9, Paul goes on to say, For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers." Another bit of hyperbole probably, but Paul is driving home the point that you are on my mind. And as he's going to say in a moment, I want to come and see you. I pray for you often. Then verse 10, "Making request, if by some means now at least I may find a way in the will of God to come to you, for I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, so that you may be established. That is, that I may be encouraged together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now, that I might have some fruit among you also, as just among the other Gentiles. I am a debtor both to the Greeks and the barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. So as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also." So there's Paul's goodwill. I want to come and see you. I want to be with you. And then in verse 16 and 17, he begins to shift gears just a little bit. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." Now, I wish that we could spend our time on those two verses this morning. I'd love to talk about those two verses, but we're actually not going to, because we're going to unfold those at length later in Paul's letter. So we're going to move on now to what Paul drops on us in verse 18 and on. And actually, there are a couple of really key points in the rest of his chapter here. And so we're going to divide it in two and just deal with one of those points today and the next one next time. So here we go, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible men, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Verse 24, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So verse 18 says that the wrath of God was revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. And how does verse 24 say that this wrath was revealed? This will be the first place to write something in your study guides. Verse 24 says, God gave them up to the lust, to their idolatry, and the lusts of their hearts. Said another way, God let them go to worship themselves, to their perverted passions and the gods of their own making. Verse 26 says, for this reason, the reason that they chose lies over truth and self-worship over true worship, God gave them up to vile passions. Here again, how did God exercise His wrath? He gave them up to their vile passions. So notice the clear implication that God is reluctantly letting people go at their insistence. Paul goes on to enlarge on the specific reasons that God is letting them go. The rest of verse 26. For even their women exchanged the natural use of what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. The NIV says, which ought not to be done. Being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Paul meets this head on, doesn't he? He doesn't leave out much of anything here. These are the ones who God gives over. Did you notice the picture here of men and women plunging themselves into total depravity? And the wrath of God is exercised against this depravity. So there's a key anchor point here that I want to introduce right at the outset before we go any further. And we must remember that everything that can be said about the character of God, including His wrath, must be said in the context of 1 John 1:8. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. There should be a place for you to write that in your study guides if you choose to do that. That's the filter that everything should be filtered through. That's the anchor that should hold us in place no matter what we're looking at in terms of the character of God, and that is that God is love. So let's dig into this word wrath just a little bit. The word wrath is used 198 times in 194 verses in the Bible. That's a lot of wrath. When we think of the word wrath, When you hear that word, when you saw the title title page on the screen this morning, the wrath of God, did any of you have any kind of a guttural response to that? You did. Probably not positive.
I'm just banking on mercy.
You're banking on mercy.
And grace.
Okay. Thank you. See, this is this tension that we have, is that on the one hand, we can't get around the fact that the Bible speaks clearly about the wrath of God, but we sure hope that there's more grace and mercy than there is wrath. Right? I hope when we're done this morning that our view changes a little bit. When we think of wrath, when you saw the title page up on the screen this morning, The Wrath of God, and you stop to think about it for a moment, I'm guessing that many of us in this room this morning, if we gave it any thought at all, had this response that wrath is unbridled passion, vindictive anger, intense vindictive anger, eyes bulging, teeth gnashing sort of thing. When we think of wrath, that's typically what we think of. A wrathful person. But is that what wrath really is? Humanly speaking, that's probably usually what wrath is, but is that what God's wrath looks like? If one examines, we're going to add another layer of confusion to the mix here. If one examines the nearly 200 occurrences of the word wrath in the Bible, it becomes apparent rather quickly that many of those occurrences, especially in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are clearly connected to anger on God's part. Now that might be a bit troubling perhaps. How can one be angry and still loving? And guess the context in the first 5 books of the Bible. What do you think the context is when anger and wrath are joined together? Who is God usually talking to? The children of Israel. The children of Israel. God is usually addressing them. God's anger and His wrath often go together, and the Bible speaks of them a great deal. So we need to see them through that filter and in the context of God is love. We also sometimes, I think of anger and wrath as the same thing. And I think we're going to find as we move through our study this morning that anger and wrath are not the same thing. They are related, but they are different. Can a loving person be angry? I remember as a kid growing up when I was about 12, somewhere around in there, I think. Well, first of all, we grew up on a small farm. And so there was always, and my dad had a job. He was an X-ray and lab technician, so he did that. That was his day job. And he worked on farming on the side to help put us kids through school. That was his night job, side job. So on a farm, there are a lot of chores to do. We had animals and sprinkler pipes to change and all of those things to take care of. And so my dad wanted to make a little bit extra money, and so he put an ad in the paper for custom hay cutting. And some of you are old enough to remember the hay mowers that went on the 3-point hitch on the tractor and had a bar that went down. You remember those? Okay. And so anyway, my dad would advertise, but he's at work. So when we got a hay job, guess who he sent out to do it? So, and I was about 12, and I remember we got this job, and he told me where it was, took me out, showed me where the job was, and he said, so tomorrow morning, I want you to go out and start cutting that hay. So I had to go out way earlier than any 12-year-old wants to get up and go to work. So I drove the tractor the 3 miles to town, and I start cutting the hay, and I made like a pass and a half or 2 around the field, and I hit a rock, and I broke a section out of the sickle. Well, you can't mow hay with a section out of the sickle. That just doesn't work. So the only thing left to do is to button it up and drive home. So I did. And well, my dad, when he got off of work, he drove by the field to see how progress was coming, and he saw that it hadn't come very far. And he could probably also see by some of the last cutting what had actually happened. So he gets home, and he said, so Greg, why didn't you finish that field today? And I think it was like 5 acres. It wasn't very big. Why didn't you mow that field today? Well, I broke a section out of the sickle, so I had to quit. And I saw the frustration in his face, and he never yelled. He didn't exhibit eye bulging, teeth grinding, any of that sort of thing. But I saw the frustration and I saw the disappointment in his face, and here's what he said to me. He said, Greg, everything you needed to fix that section was on the tractor. You had no business coming home. You should have taken it out and fixed it and finished the job. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to take it out and fix it now, and you're going to drive back to town and you're going to mow, and when it's too dark to see, I will come and pick you up. I said, but it's late in the day. Get busy. Was my dad angry? Yes, he was a little angry. Okay. But was he vindictive? No. But did he make a judgment? Did he make a judgment? Yes, he did. He made a very definite judgment about the quality of my work ethic and about my behavior, and he also made a judgment about how it was going to be fixed. And he sent me back out there, and I had to mow until it was too dark to see, and then sure enough, he came and picked me up. Another time, and I don't remember what the chores were, but we all had our chores. I have no idea what the chores were, but something I was supposed to do, and for whatever reason, I didn't get it done. So it's probably 10 o'clock at night, gone to bed, probably close to being asleep or asleep. And door opens to the bedroom, the light comes on, and my dad comes in and he says, I noticed that you didn't get XYZ done. Well, I'll do it tomorrow. He said, no, you won't do it tomorrow. He said, you'll do it now. Yeah, but it's like 10 o'clock or 10:30. I don't care. He said, get up, get your clothes on, you're going to go do it now. So I had to get up. And again, I sensed that frustration and disappointment. I gave you a responsibility, I entrusted you with a responsibility, and you let me down, and you let yourself down, and you let the farm down. So I had to get dressed, he gave me a flashlight, and I had to go out and do whatever it was that I didn't get done. Can people be loving and angry at the same time? Let's check out a couple of biblical examples of God's wrath and anger. We only have time for just a couple. There are many. This first one is in Exodus 15:7, and the context is, it's the song of Moses after Israel has gone through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians did not make it through the Red Sea. And in verse 7, here's what is recorded. And in the greatness of your excellence, you have overthrown those who rose against you. You sent forth your wrath, it consumed them, that was the Egyptians, like stubble. Did God arbitrarily destroy the Egyptians in the Red Sea? Okay, I've had it with you guys. I am so done with you. You're gone. Did God do that? Okay, let's back up a little bit. How long had God labored with Pharaoh before this day? Weeks? Months? It was months at least. Okay? It took some time for 10 plagues to play themselves out. So it wasn't a huge amount of time, but it was a period of time. 10 times, Pharaoh was invited to cooperate with God and let Israel go. What did he do? Every time he said no with a little bit more determination. I will not let Israel go. I do not know your God. Could Pharaoh have repented at some point? Sure he could have. What if on plague 5 or 6 or 9, Pharaoh would have said, you know what? It is clear to me that your God is God and I am going to obey him, and I am going to worship him. Would God have stopped the whole process right there? Would Egypt have had to have been destroyed? Although by 9 it was pretty well destroyed. No, this would have stopped. As soon as Pharaoh would have stopped his rebellion, God would have embraced him. Any point that could have stopped. Well, he finally allows Israel to go, but who chose to pursue them through the wilderness? He made that choice, did he not? He'd already seen, he'd lost his firstborn son. Everyone in Egypt had lost somebody to plague number 10. And that was the thing that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And he said, fine, go. Now he's completely abandoned his resolve, and he sets out after Israel. It was his own choice to set out after Israel. I want you to notice this. God opened a way for the saving of his people by parting the Red Sea. Could we say that God made judgment in favor of the saints? Would that be fair to say? He did, didn't he? He opened the way for them to be saved. He made judgment in favor of the saints. Parting the Red Sea was God's provision for his people. But when Pharaoh presumptuously plunged into God's provision in his stubborn rebellion, the thing that was the salvation of God's people became the very thing that destroyed Pharaoh's army. The wrath that consumed Pharaoh's army was the execution of the judgment of God made necessary by Pharaoh's undeterred rebellion. What was Pharaoh going to do? I am going to destroy God's people. It wasn't just a matter of, I want to be stubborn and do my own thing. I am going to destroy God's people. And so God pours out his wrath by making a judgment call to let Pharaoh go and to stop his undeterred rebellion against his plan. Here's another example, Deuteronomy 29, 23 through 28. The whole land is brimstone and salt and burning. It is not sown, nor does it bear, nor does any grass grow there. Like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath, all nations would say, why has the Lord done so to this land? What does the heat of his great anger mean? Then people would say, because they have forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. For they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods that they did not know and that he had not given to them. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against this land to bring on it every curse that is written in the book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, in wrath, and great indignation, and cast them into another land as it is this day. There's a lot of wrath and anger in those verses, isn't there? And if you look at the words anger, wrath, and indignation, and you look at the Hebrew definitions of those words, all three of those words are translated wrath in other places. So are we to conclude that Israel is so exasperating that God loses it and lets them have it? Is that what we're to conclude? Have we ever done that as parents? Have you ever told your kids, you just stepped on my last nerve, and you've had it? We as human beings kind of tend to do that sometimes, don't we? Does God have a last nerve? And you step on his last nerve and, man, you're going to get it. Is that how God operates? No. So we couldn't conclude, based on what we know of the character of God, that God is so frustrated with Israel, so exasperated with them, that he's going to uproot them out of their land in his fierce anger, and he's going to throw them out. This anger and wrath cause us difficulty because we can't help but associate them with the way we experience them as fallen human beings. Our anger is almost always mingled with feelings of hurt and revenge. I want you to think about the physiological reactions that occur when you get really angry. Some of you just might be able to remember the last time you were really angry. Some of us may have to think back a bit. But we've all had times when we've been, could we say, livid? What happens when you get really angry? Well, you perspire. Have you noticed that? You begin to sweat. Your heart races. Your breathing quickens. You tremble. And sometimes the most frustrating thing is you can't talk. Have you ever just wanted to just and you're so angry you can't process the words. And then you get done, you get out, and you go, man, I wish I'd have thought to say that. It's probably a good idea you didn't remember, or you weren't able to say this or that while you were in the fit of rage. But that's anger, oftentimes for us when we're angry. Anger fills us with all kinds of negative emotions that are usually directed at the people or situations that we're angry with. And we often, and even perhaps usually, experience anger in an unholy way. So we have a difficult time with the idea of a loving, perfect God being angry and exercising wrath. But let's think this through. Is it natural to witness bad things happen or experience bad things and experience negative emotions? Is that natural? This is not a trick question. Is it natural? Would it be unhealthy to witness or experience bad things and not experience a corresponding negative emotion? We might call that a psychopath. Okay? If you were to observe genuine injustice happening to another person, would that stir up anything in you? It ought to, right? And if someone you love, have given yourself to, turns on you and rejects your love and investment in them, would that evoke a negative response? It ought to. Okay? By the same token, when God's sons and daughters reject Him, His love, His sacrifice, and set on a course of self-destruction, would that evoke a negative response from God? Would it? Sure it would. Sure it would. In fact, God calls it provoking Him in His communication with Israel. Over and over He says, you provoked the Lord. You provoked the Lord. But there's a difference between God's anger and our anger. The difference is that God is absolutely other-centered. We are by nature self-centered and self-protective. His anger is not motivated in any degree by selfishness or self-hurt that conceives hatred and revenge toward the offender. God's anger is righteous and holy. I can't say that about my anger always. What motivates God's anger? You know, as we look through biblical scenarios, it seems that God's anger is motivated by the same kinds of things that would incite anger in us. Over and over, Israel turns on God or turns away from Him. Would that incite a negative response on God's part? Often He describes them as a whoring wife. That's a hard way to speak about your spouse, right? A whoring, unfaithful wife. Would that incite a negative emotion? He speaks the truth to them, but what I'm sure is that there is no animosity or self-preservation as far as a motive from God. He is angry over the havoc that sin is being allowed to wreak in the lives of His children and His creation. I want you to fast forward to the New Testament. I want you to think about the time when Jesus, there was twice actually, Jesus walked into the temple, and one of those times, before He went in the temple, He made Himself a little whip. You remember that story? And as He walked into the temple with His little whip, do you think He walked in and started shaking hands with the scribes and the Pharisees and the money changers and the people that were selling stuff and said, you know what, in just a few minutes I'm going to ask you guys to leave? Is that what He did? No, He didn't. He walked in and He says, get out of here now. Take these things out of my Father's house now. And what did they do? They were all over themselves to comply. And not only that, He started flipping their tables of money over, and this money is clanking all over the marble floors as He is shouting at them, get out of my Father's house now. You have made this place a den of thieves. Was he angry? Yes, he was angry. Did he have a reason to be angry? Yes, he did. So, what was going on in his father's house elicited a response of anger, and he acted in wrath. He didn't just stand on his door and say, I'm so angry at these wicked, so angry. He had that sense of anger, but then he followed through with the anger by taking action. And he went in with his little cord of whips, which he never used on anybody, but he had it in his hand, which I think is interesting. He took it with him. He went in and he began in a commanding tone of voice to tell them on no uncertain terms that they were out of line and to take their things and leave now. He exercised judgment, an act of judgment, an act of wrath. Can God do that? As I study this subject, what comes to mind for me is that God's anger is His displeasure against faithless stubbornness and rebellion. God's anger was always accompanied by an act of disciplinary judgment. He never got angry and just shoved it in the background. I'm really not happy about this or that, but, his anger was always acted upon. He was angry with Miriam for instigating rebellion against Moses' leadership, and he struck her with leprosy. He also healed her shortly later. On a number of occasions, God was angry with Israel for their ceaseless complaining and brought discipline, sometimes quite severe. He was angry with Gehazi for chasing down Naaman and taking the money and the clothes, and he got Naaman's leprosy. God never conceals His anger. It was always expressed in a discipline of some kind. So as we study this subject, a consistent picture emerges, at least it does to me. I see two things that God is doing with the exercise of His anger. First of all, He works to stem the tide of evil. That's what Jesus did in the temple, casting out the money changers. That's what He did with Israel over and over and over again. And number two, He exercises redemptive discipline to turn straying hearts back to Himself. You may have other things that come to mind as you think about this as well. So what does all this have to do with our study of wrath? Well, as I have studied this subject of wrath, what is God's wrath? Here's the picture that the implied picture that has shaped in my own mind, and that is this: that wrath at its core is judgment, or is the execution of judgment. Perverseness places people in a position to God outside of His protective will. So, does God zap people in judgment because they are against Him? You're against me, so I'm going to let you have it. Of course He doesn't, right? Is He petty in His actions and reactions? Of course He's not. And that cannot be, because that would be out of character with God. So, what is it then? Isn't God's primary objective always to promote righteousness and stem the tide of evil? Isn't that what He's always trying to do? Then would there be times when God would need to step in to stop rebellion in order to protect and promote goodness? And when God exercises His wrath, He is making a judgment as to what must be done in light of offenses committed, the characters of those involved, and probably a host of other things as well. There are 49 instances of the word wrath in the New Testament, and we don't have time to go through all of them, but I would like to look at one. And this is John the Baptist, Matthew 3, verse 7, and here's what it says. When He saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to His baptism, He said to them, "Brood of vipers." And I've never said that to anybody. "Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Okay. Can we see that John is warning the Pharisees about the judgment to come when God will give to everyone what they have chosen? And this idea holds true throughout the New Testament. So let's put this together as we kind of make our second to our last turn to close here today. If we go back to Romans 1:18, we see, again, Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." How is it revealed? Verse 24, Therefore God also gave them up to what did he give them up to? He gave them up to what they had chosen, uncleanness and lusts. And verse 26, "For this reason God gave them up to vile passions." And then verse 28, "Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind." Are we in this place today where our world does not want to have God anywhere in our knowledge? We really are, aren't we? And the frightening thing is, friends, and we're probably going to get into this, I'm really going to probably get myself in trouble next time. This is not just out in the world. This is soaking into the house of God more than we'd like to realize. And when you start to realize just how deeply and on what a scale that these ungodly principles have been soaking into the church, it's alarming. It's really alarming. But that's for another time. But so here's the world that does not want to have God anywhere in their knowledge, so God gave them over. What did He give them over to? He gave them over to the mind they had chosen to have. God makes a judgment call to let these people go because they will have it no other way. There are natural consequences to rebellion, but the Bible is clear that God will also execute judgment. Perhaps Revelation 14:10 describes the ultimate execution of God's judgment and wrath on those who embrace the ultimate rebellion by taking the mark of the beast. And here's what he says: "He himself also shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation." That's pretty stiff. Is it possible that this wrath poured out full strength will be the unveiled love and righteousness of God revealed in His brilliance, and that the lost will become conscious of the fullness of their guilt? However, it's too late. There's no longer a Savior. This is the ultimate letting go. Let's just take a step back for just a second, and let's just unpack just briefly what we just said. God has been calling and calling and calling every human being. He has been calling to repentance. He has left no stone unturned. He has used everything that He has available to reach every single human heart and call them to repentance. There will be some who, like Pharaoh, will just not have it. We will not have this God rule over us. And the persistent rebellion, the undeterred rebellion, will solidify into an irrevocable character. Nothing eventually will change these people. They are set on their course. They are cemented in their place. And when Jesus comes in the clouds of heaven, and He breaks into our atmosphere with His dazzling glory and brilliance, He's no longer clothed with humanity as the Son of Man. Now He is clothed with His divinity as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But He doesn't come waving His sword, threatening destruction on everybody who has rebelled against them. He comes in love and in glory and in His righteous power. And all of these people who have, in their undeterred rebellion, have said, "God, I will not have you rule over me," will stand and see that awesome spectacle of love and mercy and grace, and they will be completely, totally conscious of every bit of their guilt. Think how badly you have felt when you've thought, "Man, I did something that was really bad." How bad do you feel about that sometimes? Can you imagine the totality of your life's guilt being completely unveiled to you. You're completely conscious of it all as you are contrasted with the love that you see in the face of the Son of God. And that's why Revelation 6 says that these people cry for the mountains and the rocks to fall on them and cover them from the face of Him who sits on the throne. This, I believe, is the wrath of God poured out full strength into the cup of His indignation. He is giving these people what they have demanded to have. They will have it no other way. The ultimate letting go. I would love to have you. How can I let you go? But you have told me clearly that you want me to let you go. So I am bound by love to do what you have asked me to do, and that is to let you go. Wow, what a solemn thought. What a solemn thought. Rather than being transformed by the unveiled love of God, the wicked wish to be buried. So this, understanding the wrath of God and keeping in line with His character of love may be difficult. And I was praying about what I should share with you in closing today, and I believe it's this: that God is a perfect balance of emotion. His love is perfectly balanced with His justice. His anger and wrath are perfectly balanced with His forbearance and His grace. Nothing God does is vindictive. All of His actions toward you and me are done in love and to affirm what is good and pull us back from what would destroy us. But for those who choose that they will not have God rule over them, He will honor that choice. Many Christians believe that God is an angry God who will not hesitate to pour out retribution on anyone who crosses Him. And that God in His justice will cast the wicked into eternal suffering in hell and condemnation for all eternity. I would like to leave you with this affirmation that is not the biblical picture of God's wrath. God's wrath is not about bringing on pain and suffering. God's wrath is about making a judgment call to give every man and woman what they have chosen to have. On that final judgment day, one final judgment will be passed upon every human being. And the outcome of that judgment will be the perfect reflection of what we have chosen. It will reveal whether eternal paradise will be ours or whether God will have to let us go forever. So choose Jesus, because if you have the Son, you have everything and life. And if you don't have the Son, you have nothing. So as always, I invite you to place your trust in Jesus and leave this place in peace. So while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to say farewell to our online audience who'll be here for music and so forth, but just want to say thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to invite our worship team to come up and have our closing song.